She survived the lion's hunger, but not its silence. There is a peculiar cruelty in being the last. The banquet has ended, the torches dim, and all the screams have already been swallowed by stone. The queen sits not upon a throne, but upon an echo, a chair left warm by the women who bled before her. Her crown carries no triumph, only dust. Catherine Parr, the sixth, the final, the spared, so they whisper. But mercy is a lie told with tired breath. It is not kindness that left her standing when the others fell. It is the burden of being the final verse in a song too soaked with grief to continue. No blood on the scaffold, no blade at her neck, and yet her death was worse. It was slow, it was invisible. It came with lace and lullabies, with the smell of milk and fire. They say she was wise, that she tamed a tyrant, that she read her scriptures and held her tongue. But no scripture warns a woman that her womb can become her tomb. No parable prepares a queen to be devoured from within. The king died before her, but his shadow did not. It lay beside her in the dark, whispering the names of his dead wives like a curse pressed to her lips. Jane, Anne, Catherine, again and again, until her own name felt foreign, a borrowed thread in a tapestry stitched with rot. There was no crown in her hands when she died, only fever and a child too new to scream, a girl born in a blaze of white linens and black prayers, her mother vanishing between the stitches. And in the silence that followed, no fanfare, no weeping choir, only the creak of a door that would never open again. Catherine Parr was not executed. She was erased, and the manner of her death, not loud, not public, but far more monstrous. Now, tell me what kind of queen dies with her eyes wide open, staring into the cradle, and sees nothing but smoke. She was born into a world that stitched women shut with silence and taught queens to smile as they were flayed by ceremony. Catherine Parr had not asked for a crown, nor for the poisoned privilege of surviving the tyrant's embrace. But she bore it like iron softened in fire, with stillness, with calculation, with a gaze that did not tremble when it met power. Her beauty was not the kind that sparked war or bled easily beneath a blade. It was the beauty of restraint, of hidden knives, of letters composed with no salutation and no hope of reply. When she entered court, she moved like a shadow, pretending to be light, and Henry, already swollen with gout and ghosts, saw in her not temptation, but usefulness. She did not scream when he spoke of scripture, nor wilt when he recalled the color of Jane Seymour's eyes. She listened, and in listening, became his mirror. But mirrors that reflect too faithfully often reveal what should remain buried. In her chamber, she burned books by candlelight and rememorized the words by heart. In her soul, a quiet revolt bloomed not of armies, but of ink. She debated bishops with breathless care, smiling as she stitched doctrine into dinner conversation. She kissed the hand that murdered Anne Boleyn and whispered prayers for the child Elizabeth, exiled and watching. The court around her was a stage of rotting velvet. The courtiers played roles rehearsed in fear: the laughing fool, the loyal traitor, the trembling sycophant. Even the walls seemed to listen, soaked in betrayal. Ghosts walked freely there. Catherine knew them all by name. Catherine of Aragon, who died with her rosary clenched like a chain. Anne, whose mouth had not stopped moving even after the axe struck. Jane, whose silence birthed a son and whose absence remained the loudest hymn in Henry's ears. Anne of Cleves, discarded like a painting miscolored. Catherine Howard, the child queen with terror in her voice as she was dragged to the block. Catherine Parr learned from their ends. Like a scholar poring over sacred wounds, she did not defy him openly. She kissed the tyrant's brow with calculated warmth. When he raged, she cooled his madness with scripture. When he demanded obedience, She gave it in flourishes, as if submission were a performance that could end in applause instead of execution. But inside her grew a garden of locked doors. She wrote her secrets in margins, behind psalms. She watched his courtiers shift like wolves circling a dying stag. She knew how fast favor could rot. A misplaced word, a glance too long, and the noose would return like an old friend. The air in court was thick with perfume and panic. Even the gowns smelled of death, stitched from brocade and the unspoken screams of those who wore them before. When she walked through corridors lined with tapestries, she saw not hunts or saints, but shadows stitched with red thread. Blood turned ornamental. She held the hand of a dying king and saw in his eyes not love, but the slow realization that nothing, not suns nor palaces nor a God-forged will, could keep decay at bay. He was a man undone by his own myth, and Catherine, the final wife, the widow-to-be, watched him rot like a statue weeping rust. When Henry died, it was not peace that followed, but a brief and dangerous stillness. The throne had bled dry the women who touched it, and now it demanded something new. Catherine, for a breath of time, was free. But freedom for a woman in Tudor England was a shallow grave with a velvet lining. She remarried quickly, Thomas Seymour, the king's brother-in-law, a man whose ambition smelled of roses and ruin. There were those who whispered it was love, that after years of pretending, she had chosen desire. But desire is often the prettiest mask that betrayal wears. Seymour was fire hidden in flesh, all charm and chaos. He wanted power, not devotion, and Catherine, already wearied by crowns, gave him both with trembling grace. The court changed masks again. Edward, the boy king, cold and controlled. Elizabeth, watching everything and saying nothing. Mary, lurking like a storm not yet born. Catherine stood amidst the shifting players and tried to build a new world, not of thrones, but of learning. She gathered books, scholars, taught girls to read with hands that still remembered the weight of royal rings. But her body, long a battlefield, betrayed her. She became pregnant, a final cruel miracle. The queen, whose mind had survived a tyrant, now had to surrender her flesh to childbirth, the ancient ritual that had undone queens with cleaner hands and quieter lives. Her belly swelled as the court's eyes narrowed. She was no longer a queen, she was a womb, and the child within her would not bring salvation, only the scent of endings. The castle where she waited, Sudeley, was no palace. It was colder, quieter, a house too familiar with grief. The tapestries were thin, the prayers thinner, and as the months crawled forward, Catherine wrote again letters filled with doubt, ink smeared by fever. Her skin paled, her eyes sank. She dreamt of blood on white sheets and hands that would not hold. She wrote to her husband, but he no longer lingered. Seymour, already hungry for more, plotted with eyes turned elsewhere. He had no patience for pain that did not elevate him. As Catherine groaned beneath moonlight and midwives, he wandered halls, whispering to ghosts that bore his name no loyalty. The child came like a scream swallowed in velvet, a daughter unnamed for days. Catherine smiled through blood and tremors. And then the fever came. It was not swift, but it was merciless. Her flesh burned, her breath soured, her words dissolved into delirium. She wept for nothing, clawed at blankets, begged for things the midwives could not understand. The queen who had survived kings was being devoured from within by a fire no prayer could quench. And still, no trumpets sounded, no court wept. She died in a room too small for memory, her body broken by the same ritual that had made her royal. Her legacy was not sealed with marble. It faded like breath on glass. And Thomas Seymour, already scheming, did not grieve. He placed his ambition above her grave and moved on. The child she bore would not live long either. A girl born in shadow, carried away in silence. Catherine Parr, queen consort, regent, scholar, survivor, ended not in triumph, nor in betrayal grand enough for legend. She ended in a fever dream, half-conscious, surrounded by prayers that sounded like apologies. No sword touched her. No mob screamed her name. And yet, of all the women who touched Henry's crown, hers was the death that lingered longest slow, whispered, and without mercy. Her name was written last, but the ink never dried. Betrayal seldom arrives with the scream of steel. It enters softly, wrapped in silk, breathing through lips that once spoke vows in candlelight. Catherine Parr, whose mind had withstood the bloated tyranny of Henry's wrath and whose tongue had danced on the edge of scripture without falling, now found herself sinking beneath subtler weights, not the sharpness of a king's suspicion, but the erosion of her own household, her own marriage, her own body. After the king's corpse cooled and the court rethreaded its mask, she remarried with a haste that stank not of passion, but of prophecy. Thomas Seymour, brother to the Lord Protector, carried ambition like a disease under his tongue, masked by the gleam of a smile and the softness of hands not yet bloodied. He spoke to her in warmth, but kissed power when her eyes turned. What she mistook for partnership was possession. What she hoped was sanctuary became scaffolding for his own ascent. And in that house where she had hoped for stillness, for books, for birth and prayer, the conspiracies came like damp rising from the floor, slow and sure and everywhere. He wanted more, not the woman, not her words, but her gateway, her reach, her symbolic worth. He courted the child Elizabeth with the same laughter he once offered Catherine, playfulness that clung to the edge of impropriety, games at dawn, touches too long, glances that left silence in their wake. The princess stood like a statue cut from caution, neither recoiling nor returning, but storing each moment like frost storing night. Catherine saw it unfold, not in confession, but in the unease of servants, in the way Elizabeth flinched not from him, but from Catherine's presence, as if shame had become a third presence in the room. Still, the queen said nothing. Still, she watched, her body swelled with the final burden of womanhood, a child stirring in the dark cradle of her womb, and still her husband plotted, not with swords, but with signatures, whispered promises behind closed doors, letters that smelled of heat and sealing wax. He sought permission to wed Elizabeth should Catherine perish, a petition that clanged like prophecy. He approached the young king, Edward, not as uncle but as vulture, and spoke of loyalty in phrases worn hollow by greed. He pressed coin into palms, flattered enemies, pulled strings until the court trembled with the sound of paper-thin allegiances. Catherine felt it all in her bones, not as rumor, but as infection. Her sleep grew ragged, her writings fractured. The eloquent queen who had debated theology with bishops now scribbled half-prayers in the margins of psalms, her ink betraying what her lips could not. She could no longer separate the fever of her body from the rot around her. The man who once kissed her fingertips now vanished for days, returned with news wrapped in riddles, avoided her eyes. She began to prepare for her death not with fear, but with arrangement, a will rewritten, a cradle blessed, a nursemaid appointed not by love, but by calculation. She had learned from the other wives that women are only mourned if they leave a tidy absence. She arranged her disappearance like a sermon, and Seymour, growing impatient, leaned harder into desperation. His charm slipped, his tempers flared, his ambitions swelled beyond the corridors of propriety and into the realm of danger. The Lord Protector, his own brother, began to circle like a hawk sensing madness beneath the feathers. The court was no longer a place of worship, but of watching. Every whisper had a listener. Every shadow had a spine. Catherine's name was no longer spoken with reverence, but with curiosity, as if her survival had become an inconvenience to a history already eager to forget. Her steps grew slower. Her hands, once steady, trembled. The air around her grew colder. Not with season, but with inevitability. The baby within her kicked as if trying to flee before the end. And still Thomas stood beside her, smiling like a man carving epitaphs into the living. He had already envisioned the next crown, the next bed, the next betrayal. When Catherine went into labor, her screams echoed through the stone like a reckoning. The midwives rushed, their fingers wet with urgency, but nothing could staunch the tide. The blood came too fast, too dark. The queen who had survived a monster now faced the one death no scripture had prepared her for, the slow suffocation of being replaced before being buried. While she labored, Thomas plotted. While she bled, he whispered. And when she slipped into fever, her body hot as the breath of judgment, he was gone again, this time not to war, but to persuade, to seduce, to stake claim on futures not yet his. She saw it all behind her closed eyes. The betrayal was not loud, but it was total. Her household was no longer hers. Her child, though born alive, would be claimed not in joy, but in calculation. She, once a queen, now became a vessel emptied and discarded. Her servants prayed for her. Her child whimpered. Her husband strategized. And in that house, Catherine Parr learned loyal. The last died not with a sword at her throat or poison in her wine, but with the quiet horror of being used until empty. Seymour's downfall would come, but not for her benefit. He would be caught, interrogated, tried, his trespasses too naked to hide, breaking into the king's apartments, manipulating the regency, speaking of marriage to Elizabeth as if death were already written into Catherine's womb. He was beheaded in due course, and still no one spoke her name. His treason became a footnote. Her suffering became silence. And the daughter, Mary, vanished into shadow, no tomb, no date, no elegy. That, too, was betrayal. To live through kings, through scripture, through fire, only to die in absence, to be swept from the stage before her final line. Catherine Parr was not overthrown, not exiled, not executed. She was spent, like a candle allowed to burn, past usefulness. She was betrayed not by blade, but by indifference, by the unbearable slowness of being erased in pieces. And no ballad sings of the queen who died while her husband watched the door for better crowns. It did not begin with blood, but with silence, the kind that folds itself into corners and waits, breathless, patient, like a veil laid gently over the face of a woman who still breathes. In the dim corridors of Sudeley Castle, where the walls whispered with the weight of forgotten prayers, Catherine Parr awoke to the ache of coming death. Not sudden, not sharp, just a slow unraveling, as if the thread that held her together had grown tired of its task. The child had come, small and quiet, a girl with pale fists and an uncertain cry, born in a bed drenched not only in sweat and blood, but in a history that did not want her. Catherine, drained, broken open by the oldest violence known to women, tried to smile through the haze of her agony, but her lips cracked and trembled, and her eyes stared into the cradle as if it were a coffin in disguise. Around her, the midwives moved like ghosts, their hands shaking, their voices hushed to the pitch of mourning. Fever bloomed in her veins like black roses, invisible at first, then all-consuming. Her flesh burned, her breath grew thick with the sour sweetness of rot. She whispered psalms in fragments, words falling out of her mouth like loose teeth. She asked for Thomas. He did not come. She asked again, louder, then fell back, eyes wide with a realization colder than the stone floor beside her bed. He was not coming. Not really. Not as a man. Not as a husband. If he stood by her now, it would be with eyes already turned toward the next opportunity. Toward the girl Elizabeth, whose youth shone like oil upon the surface of a stagnant court. Catherine saw it then. Not with suspicion, but with a clarity so brutal it quieted her pain. She had been useful, not loved. She had been a corridor, not a destination. Her mind, still sharp beneath the delirium, counted betrayals like beads on a rosary. The lies wrapped in silk, the kisses pressed to her forehead like benedictions before abandonment, the laughter shared with Elizabeth behind closed doors, the petition to marry the girl once Catherine's body had gone cold. The fever took her by degrees. Her hands curled like roots. Her voice dropped into a rasp that sounded more animal than human. She thrashed, muttered, begged for water, then for nothing. The priests arrived too late, their robes reeking of incense and cowardice. They spoke the rites with brittle voices, their Latin thin and breaking, as if they feared the queen's soul might drag theirs into the abyss alongside it. Catherine did not hear them. She was already somewhere else, walking corridors made of memory, touching tapestries that bled beneath her fingers, hearing the laughter of Anne Boleyn echoing from the scaffold, the sobs of Catherine Howard rattling down stone stairwells, the heavy breath of Jane Seymour echoing in the cradle's rocking. She saw herself seated beside Henry's bloated corpse, saw his crown gleaming atop a body that no longer ruled anything but decay, saw the way he looked at her in the final months less like a man in love, more like a monument crumbling from within. She remembered how the court had changed after his death, how its masks grew heavier, how Thomas's voice sharpened even as his hands softened. She remembered how Elizabeth's smile stiffened, how the servants avoided eye contact, how even the hounds in the yard seemed to watch her differently, their heads tilted as if already mourning. And then she saw nothing. The moment of her death was not marked by any scream, not by any cry, but by the flicker of a candle extinguished by its own heat. Her body lay still, the linens soaked with the evidence of her undoing. Her mouth slightly open as if trying to speak a final word no one had earned the right to hear. Thomas Seymour, when told, said nothing. He nodded once, then returned to his business. No public mourning, no great procession. She was buried quickly, in a chapel not yet finished, beneath stone too modest for a queen, her name etched in Latin, her titles abbreviated as if even death had grown weary of her full story. The child was named Mary, but no lullabies were written for her. She was passed from hand to hand, a daughter of ruin, a fragment of a once daring legacy now treated as inconvenience. She vanished from the records before her 6th year. No burial noted, no gravestone marked. Perhaps she died of fever. Perhaps she lived long enough to forget her mother's voice. Perhaps she simply disappeared into the folds of history's indifference. Catherine's books, her writings, her letters, her meticulous arguments in defense of conscience were quietly withdrawn from favor. Her Protestant courage, once her shield, now became a liability. The world she had tried to shape through ink and prayer was reshaped without her. Thomas Seymour fell next, but not as martyr nor fool, only as a man too greedy to survive his own reflection. His betrayal came to light in all its vulgar detail, the attempted entry into the boy king's chamber at night, the seduction of a princess under his roof, the whispered plans to wed Elizabeth, the reckless hunger that finally consumed him. He was arrested, condemned, and beheaded. The axe that kissed his neck was the same that had claimed better men for smaller crimes. And still, no one spoke of Catherine, the queen who had survived tyranny, written in defiance, died giving life, and watched her husband betray her while her body broke. She was left behind. Her legacy did not blossom. It bled out slowly, soaked into the cold stone of Sudeley, carried only in the reluctant memories of those who had watched her wither. Elizabeth, the girl who survived her, remembered. She remembered everything. The touch, the eyes, the silence. She never spoke of it, but she built her reign from its bones. She never married. She turned courtship into spectacle, made virginity a shield, and wielded solitude like a sword. In her silence was Catherine. In her refusal was Catherine. In her every calculated delay, every delayed answer to the question of marriage, every pointed turn away from intimacy, Catherine Parr's shadow loomed. Elizabeth understood what it meant to die slowly while being watched, what it meant to be used and then forgotten. That was the Queen's final gift. Not a child, not a book, but a lesson carved into a living girl's spine. And now, in the chapel where Catherine lies, no prayers rise, only wind. The tomb is simple. The visitors pass through in whispers. Some kneel, some do not. No monarch has visited it in centuries. No child has laid a flower. And yet the stones remain damp. The air remains heavy. Those who stay too long in that chapel report a chill that climbs the spine, a weight behind the eyes, the sense of having interrupted something, grief unfinished, breath withheld. Catherine Parr's death did not end her. It only began the long, aching silence she left behind. And if ghosts do linger, it is not to haunt, but to remind that some queens die not for their sins, but for their usefulness. That some stories are not buried, only left unwritten. That the final wife, the surviving scholar, the quiet revolutionary, did not scream when she died. But somewhere, something did. The room remains locked in breathless pause, as if time itself fears disturbing what still sleeps beneath the stone. Her name, half remembered, rests beneath dust and forgetting. But her absence has shape, and that shape lingers where the sun does not reach. No bells marked her passing, no empire wept. She did not die in the blaze of politics or under the shadow of execution, but in the slow unraveling of flesh, of trust, of memory. And yet, that silence is more violent than any sword. Catherine Parr, last wife of a dying god-king, did not meet her end in defiance or disgrace, but in surrender not to a man, but to a pattern too ancient to break. She was the final mirror, and when she cracked, no one dared look into what was left. The child vanished, the husband condemned, the crown passed on, and still she lies beneath the chapel where the air is colder than it should be, where candles burn too low and the stone seems to breathe. There are no voices now, only the echo of a question no one has yet dared answer. How many women must be broken for a throne to remain standing? No reply comes, only a breeze that smells faintly of blood and lavender. If you stand long enough at her tomb, the silence will begin to whisper. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough. Enough to remind you that history forgets what it cannot bear. Enough to make you wonder if she truly died, or if the world simply agreed to pretend she had. Her legacy is not written in books nor sung in choirs. It is etched into the quiet between footsteps, the breath before a betrayal, the ache left behind when a name is erased. And that is how she endures.